Okay. The number one question I get is what happened? And I've realized I never really talked about what happened. I just have talked about birth trauma. I've written about this story before, but I've never talked about it. So because I want to get back to my normal programming of like fashion and mommy stuff and singing and whatever else I want to share, I figure let's just talk about it and move on. So I had something called placenta previa. I was diagnosed like pretty early on. Maybe 12 weeks, could have been earlier, but I think it was around 12 weeks. Placenta previa is when your placenta is covering your cervix. And as your uterus grows, it moves. But in my case, I had 3 previous C-sections, plus I had a miscarriage and I had a D&C, which causes more scar tissue. So my placenta ended up attaching to the scar tissue and it never moved. So that's dangerous in many ways because A, you can't give birth vaginally, but you also have the potential of it turning into placenta accreta. And that's what happened in my case. My placenta ended up growing through my uterus, almost infiltrated my bladder. So it was growing through my organs, but we got it out in time that it didn't actually go through the bladder, it was touching the bladder. So basically what happened is at 20 weeks, I went on bed rest, which was hard in itself. And then at 30 weeks is when I experienced my first bleed, which is scary because you see a lot of blood, and when you're pregnant, you're not supposed to see a lot of blood coming out. I ran to the hospital, they were able to control it. I went home, was on bed rest. And I literally went to my doctor every Monday, the hospital every Friday to get a scan. They knew they were gonna get the baby out early, they just didn't know how quickly. So by 34 weeks is when I experienced my second bleed, and it was a very big one. That's went in the hospital, called my doctor, and that's when she looked at me and said, we have to get you up to Yale. So they ambulanced me up to Yale and they did their own tests. But when I was in the scan, the doctor just went silent. And I remember this silent feeling being like, oh my gosh, like this is it. She turned off the scan, looked at me and essentially said, say goodbye to your family. We are going to do a vertical scar. We most likely will get a hysterectomy and we have to do this now. We're updating parents and crying, and I was just kind of sitting there in shock and being like, okay, let's do this. The anesthesiologist was clearing the floor because they were like, everyone's all hands on deck. Went in, saw the baby come out, but then I started violently throwing up and they put me out. I woke up in the ICU. Apparently my uterus did rupture. So they were planning on giving me a hysterectomy, but they had to act fast because there was a lot of blood. They said that it was against the bladder, but they made sure to look inside to make sure there was no infiltration, nothing growing through. Otherwise you would have to get bladder reconstructive surgery. I did not have to get that, thank God. I didn't feel great because I lost a lot of blood. I had a lot of blood transfusions. And that night I started violently throwing up. And they took me to the CT scan because something was just not right. And they realized my gut was shutting down. I want to say like if it ruptures at like a 9, I was on like an 8. They had to immediately put an NG tube down my nose, down my throat, into my stomach to get the liquid out because I was on the verge of rupturing my stomach. So they had to hold me down. Anyone that is in the medical field, when I say I got an NG tube, they're like, I can't believe you did that right after what happened, because it's one of the most traumatic things for a patient to go through. Felt everything, blood was coming out of my nose, mouth. It was very uncomfortable because there's nothing you can do. It's like kind of like emergent. You can't have Novocaine, you can't be asleep. It's like you get held down, it's gonna be horrible, and you put this thing down your nose. And it was very traumatic because basically I was attached to that, and this thing behind me that my stomach was being pumped into because my stomach wasn't working, and they had to get this out, otherwise it would have ruptured. It was really hard. I was in the hospital for a while. I almost had no will to live. It just felt very dark. And also, I haven't even seen my baby. I can't even stand. I can't even like meet him. They did wheel me up at one point. They made an exception and got me there. but everything is really blurry. When you are in your darkest place, when I was in that hospital, I really, at one point, was like, I just want this to stop. And then you're given another chance, almost. I'm not gonna mess around with that. I always tell Liam, you're gonna do big things, and I'm gonna do big things now too. I'm alive. I fixed my issues. My surgeon who actually just did my abdominoplasty said that it was one of the worst split abs he's ever seen. I had 2 hernias, and he brought my abs back together and sewed them back tight and fixed my hernias and got rid of my vertical scar, which I can't even tell you how much it means. I mean, obviously the look-wise that's one thing, but just getting rid of that scar. I mean, that's my story. It's obviously I didn't really go into the emotional parts of it because I don't want to break down, but my baby and I are doing great. Obviously, you know, I've fixed everything, and I can move on. So, back to normal programming.